Jeff. Thanks for organizing this talk, and thanks to everybody participating. Once you told me that we could have a meeting about the Quad, you knew I was in. The Quad has been a subject of interest to me and to Heritage for many years. We've been strong proponents of the idea of the Quad. And anytime I have an opportunity to get together with other experts and have a discussion on where it is and where it's headed, I'm in. Just eliminate some background sound there. All right, so I'm really happy to go in whatever direction you think is most productive with this conversation, but let me put a few things on the table, maybe that can get us started. I wrote an article that some of you might have seen for War on the Rocks a few months ago on the Quad, and I made a few points that are probably worth rehashing here, and I'm interested if others agree or maybe diverge from some of these conclusions. But I think in large part the second iteration of the Quad is the future is brighter. I think it's already proving more durable, largely because India, I think, is more invested as a partner. But I think, frankly, all the parties are more invested in the Quad right now. All of them have witnessed rising threat perceptions vis-a-vis China, rising concerns vis-a-vis China, and less hesitation, less resistance to things like the Quad domestically. I think the biggest change is probably in India, but there are similar changes underway elsewhere. And as Tanvi pointed out before, and I have as well, there was resistance to the idea of the Quad among the other capitals during the first iteration. So I think support is more rock solid all around. A lot of the Quad moving at a slow, sort of deliberative pace. I personally don't think that's a major problem for the Quad right now. I think by design, it remains a malleable, agile coalition, offering for stability in how much they want to scale up or down, go broader or higher. At this point, it's almost less important what the Quad does than what it signals and symbolizes. And in some ways, it's a weather vane on the democracy's threat perceptions vis-a-vis China. I make the case that the Quad's core membership probably should remain fixed, even as it seeks to build functional coalitions with like-minded countries, the way it's done with the pandemic response group. I think there are other areas where that could be replicated. And I think that the Quad will find willing partners in the Indo-Pacific. I think there is a misperception that the region is uncomfortable with the Quad. There are some elements of truth to that, in the sense that I think ASEAN countries are uncomfortable with the idea of losing the centrality of ASEAN institutions in regional policymaking and security forums. But most, I think, polling actually shows that both the elites and the public are comfortable with the idea of the Quad and want to work with it more. What they don't want it to do is to diminish ASEAN centrality. They don't want it to become a anti-China containment coalition. But in its current form, I think they see it as relatively valuable and something worth cooperating with when interests align. And so I argued that the point of the Quad, first of all, one of the things that I think makes the Quad unique is the ability and willingness of the four members to say no to Beijing, to resist Chinese coercion tactics and territorial aggression. That's not the case in a lot of Indo-Pacific capitals, where Beijing holds almost a veto these days on things that it views as not in its interest. With the Quad countries, China cannot bully and coerce and push around these capitals the way it can with others. And I think it's notable that, on Huawei and the Belt and Road Initiative, really two of President Xi's signature initiatives, strategic geoeconomic initiatives, all 4 members of the Quad have essentially said no dice. And in some ways, that's what sets them apart. I also make the point that I don't think it's helpful to talk about the Quad as a containment coalition. I don't think the point of the Quad is to launch a containment policy. It's to present a more united front of highly capable democracies that can have a deterrent effect on Chinese adventurism, Chinese efforts to upset the status quo, Chinese efforts to coerce these capitals. Ultimately, the goal is to win these battles without fighting, and I think the Quad, frankly, makes that more likely. There's not much I can tell this group about the Quad that they don't already know, because you're all sort of experts in this field. But I would be interested in maybe exploring a little bit what others think are the biggest challenges facing the Quad moving forward. But also what opportunities should the Quad be looking at? Where should they be spending their energy if folks are looking at expanding the scope or enhancing activities? What makes the most sense? And some of the items I threw out there: expanding cooperation on space and maritime domain awareness, the infamous invitation to Australia to join the Malabar exercises, coordinating on transparent and sustainable infrastructure options. These are some things that the democracies are already doing together, but there's a question of whether they should be brought under the Quad banner. Issuing joint statements after each Quad, and to date we have all 4 parties kind of issuing their own language, even though it's generally, largely in alignment with very few differences. I think it would be productive to organize a Quad head of state meeting at some point. We have Russia, India, China leaders can meet on stage. I don't see any reason why the Quad leaders can't meet at some future date on the sidelines of UNGA or one of the ASEAN meetings. Adding humanitarian aid and disaster relief to the Quad's agenda is kind of a no-brainer. That's how the Quad got started, in my opinion. That would be a productive step. Inaugurating new forms of joint exercises and group sales, and expanding joint training with Quad militaries at U.S. facilities like Anderson Air Force Base in Guam. So those are some I'd like to throw on the table, but I would be interested in hearing from others' biggest risks and biggest opportunities, and also what language we should be using when talking about the Quad. Deputy Secretary of State just this week, I thought, used interesting formulation when he was discussing the Quad. Steve Beacon said, "Together with Japan and Australia, we are 4 democratic anchors in an Indo-Pacific region buffeted by changing winds and shifting currents. We each have our imperfections and our own histories that steered our democratic paths, but we share values as well as common interests." The Quad is a partnership driven by shared interests, not binding obligations, and is not intended to be an exclusive grouping. Any country that seeks a free and open Indo-Pacific and is willing to take steps to ensure that should be welcome to work with us. I thought that was a fairly good framing language used by Beacon, but I'm interested again in thoughts from others on how the Trump administration has sort of sold and promoted the Quad. What are the biggest risks and opportunities moving forward? And do folks sort of diverge with my takeaways from the recreation of the Quad 2.0? And I'm sure Jeff Payne probably has some question injections as well.
I'll hold off. I'll let others jump in. I know everyone else will have thoughts. So, Jake, I see your hand popped up, so we'll turn the mic over to you.
Sure. Well, thanks everyone, and thanks Jeff, both Jeffs. That was a really great introduction. Just to pick up off your question, I think one of the challenges that will sort of remain to be seen is given Prime Minister or former Prime Minister, Japanese Prime Minister Abe's role in driving the Quad, and the Quad as a vehicle for the concept of a free and open Indo-Pacific, whether the Suga administration, but further on down the road, subsequent prime ministers will be in Japan will be able to basically pick up the baton for Japan in driving this framework forward. Just because Prime Minister Abe played such a personally strong role in driving these concepts, but also bringing all the players together. Certainly Prime Minister Suga appears to be, working in the Abe mold to the extent that he's able to do that. So I think that's one of the big open questions that we'll be thinking about in the coming years relating to the Quad. Secondly, on the language question, I think there's a lot. It's on the relationship to China. Certainly, containment is such a fraught terminology. I personally like the terminology of balancing. I think it doesn't obfuscate too much on the geopolitical element, but it's also not, I think, as aggressive as containment. And obviously, given the the implications for containment in the Chinese Communist Party's historical read and the world's historical read about causing the end of the regime, how it's so loaded. But I do think balancing is really useful. So I would put that to the group about whether that might be one way to talk about its geopolitical role. Thanks.
Thanks, Jake. I think that's a key point.
Yeah, and one of the points I made in the piece was that is one of the unknowns. The revival of the Quad has essentially happened under 4 conservative governments that are sort of largely unchanged since 2017. And so there are some questions about what changes in domestic politics and leadership could bring for the Quad. I tend to think that there's not really a great incentive in any of the capitals to make a sort of sharp break from the trajectory now. I think the sting of the collapse of the first Quad still lingers. I think they recognize that pulling out of the Quad would have the optics would be suboptimal, to say the least, with the other democracies. And in none of these countries is there really like a strong push toward engagement with China right now. In fact, I think in most countries, Japan may be a bit different, but certainly the other 3, the perceptions of China, threat perceptions are rising, and there's less interest in being deferential toward China. And so I kind of find it hard to envision what mixture of domestic international incentives would prompt one of the countries to want to withdraw from the Quad. They might resist, proposals to move it forward faster. And I could be wrong on this, but I don't see a lot of incentives to pull away. But we just don't know what future administrations would bring. I mean, it could be a Bernie Sanders race with President Trump right now, and were he to win, who knows what foreign policy he would pursue with regard to the Quad. So I agree with you that is one of these variables, unknown variables that could impact the Quad.
So just a couple of points. I think, in terms of describing the objectives of the Quad, I think kind of broad objectives, I mean, I think Jake's point is right, which is you want to do it in a way that both makes this sustainable in terms of all the 4 countries, but also doesn't then allow China to do what it has consistently done, which is try to convince the ASEANs in particular, but also countries like South Korea, that this is an exclusionary platform or vehicle, an Asian NATO that is going to destabilize the region because it is aggressive. So I think, the kind of broader framing helps in terms of objectives, and I think that also more accurately reflects what the countries are trying to do. And the way that I've tended to put these three, and I don't think they're kind of exclusive to what everybody else has said, which is to maintain the rules-based order in the region, whether or not you want to call it a free, open, inclusive, but essentially maintain a rules-based order in the region. Second, to ensure a favorable balance of power in the region, or as kind of, I think Marie Payne said it, a strategic balance, to maintain a strategic balance in the region. And then kind of, finally to deter certain kinds of assertive behavior. Now, whether or not you want to name China, that's essentially what, and also shape it in a positive way that, it's here are the, so, take regional connectivity, true setting of a higher level of standards, encourage China or have smaller countries who are aware of, for example, these standards, and regional connectivity or quality infrastructure is one area that the Quad talks about, is that you actually put forth an alternative, which then smaller states in the region, even if they don't want to join the Quad, they can benefit from these standards that have been set. And so, I think framing these things in the broader sense, just a couple of things on risks and opportunities. I think, there has obviously been some discussion, which will be front and center, about kind of transitions of government and will this survive? And it's not just Quad or no, but what do you do with the Quad? Do you downgrade it? Does it stay at the same? Does it continue to meet as regularly? Because at this point, it's meeting twice a year at the working level, and kind of might see an annual ministerial. None of this is actually, people talk about logistically hard. I actually think it's one of the easier ones, other than the prep that goes in. But where you meet logistically, it's tended to meet on the sidelines of ASEAN or kind of EAS or other kind of Southeast Asian meetings. So most of the meetings, this has been an exception, have been in Manila, in Bangkok, in Singapore. So, and I think the Quad countries should use that kind of opportunity to also, when they're engaging with Southeast Asians in particular, explain what the Quad is and it isn't, because I think that is going to be important. And I do think it is important, as Australia, India, and Japan have done over the first few years, is to also ensure that, even if it's not with ASEAN as a body, to ensure that engagement with Southeast Asia continues at a good pace, because I think that'll again make them feel less neglected. Finally, I'll just say, I think it's very important vis-a-vis the Quad to think about the constituents of the Quad and what they're doing with each other and with others in some permutation and combination beyond the four of them themselves. So, there are things that the Quad is doing, and I hate to put in a plug for the charts I did, but do take a look at them on the Quad. There's a certain set of things the Quad is doing together, especially meeting and discussing a certain set of issues. But there are a lot of things that, the Quad is either doing with others, the Quad plus discussions on COVID, for example, with South Korea, New Zealand, and Vietnam. There was one other kind of Quad plus with Brazil, Israel, and South Korea, but Japan seemed to have dropped off, so I don't know if it's quite a Quad plus. Or, there's US, India, Japan group sales through the Philippines, or there's a Australia, US, Japan, Korea Pacific Vanguard exercise. Things like that, which I think are important. So it is the constituents within and what they're doing, the trilats. There are overlapping trilats across the board, and bring in also France and Indonesia and South Korea, I think, as well, and the bilaterals. And so I think there are things that can add up over time to the Quad countries, even if not the Quad, doing things together and having this progress through that. So I think, as we go forward, part of what will make this sustainable is recognition by the Quad that there's a lot of stuff that they don't have to do everything together, but also that there are certain spaces where it might actually make sense to do this with some that are like-minded. So this serves as a platform, a facilitating platform, but not the only platform because I think that's when you start getting into a situation when a new government comes along, they have different priorities, say ASEAN or something else, and they decide, well, this has been getting too much attention, so let's downgrade it.
Josh, I see you had your hand up. I'll turn it over to you.
Thanks. Good to be here with a great group of friends and colleagues. I think on this, following on Tanvi's point, I've been quite enthusiastic with the Quad, but in a sense, occasionally uncomfortable with the level of hyperbole that has been associated with it, and in some ways, level of attention that it is received, in part because I think most good things start slowly and take time. I've probably told the story to some of you, but when I came to the White House, I was pretty interested in where this is the late Obama years, interested in the U.S. into Japan trilateral, and I asked staff to pull together all of the cables and readouts internally that we had from that trilateral series of engagements, and I read through them, and that trilateral had done a lot of good work. It's turned into a very important forum that has engaged a wide range of issues. But the first number of meetings of that trilateral were really quite dull, if I could use that diplomatic word. They moved very slowly. It takes a while to build trust, to formulate an agenda that is workable, to establish an up-tempo of meetings that is doable. I think we should have the same expectations for the Quad, which is in many ways very sensible, natural arrangement of countries. In some ways, I think that there's a risk of an expectations gap that we have to avoid with Quad. And for this reason, if I were shaping the language that the United States used to speak about this, I would try to lower expectations and then exceed them. I think it's probably wise to talk about the Quad less in terms of the building blocks of the future Asian security architecture, or make intimations to that effect, to talk about the Quad as a contact group based on common values, interests. I'm a little bit wary of the language that Jeff quoted from Deputy Secretary Bien about the Quad not intended to be an exclusive group. And in a sense, I think I understand that discourse, because the idea is to communicate that it is not a grouping solely focused on one other country, namely China. But we know as a practical matter that exclusivity has some value. That if the Quad were less exclusive, if we start talking about Quad plus formulations, then the Quad as a contact group is likely to become somewhat less effective. Its value that it brings together like-minded countries, similar interests and values, but also relatively high capacity countries. And so I think, I guess I'm making the case for a somewhat more modest rendering of how we talk about the Quad, but also seeing that there is some value to exclusivity, and that doesn't mean that the Quad is still focused on one set of threats or objectives.
Thank you, Josh. That's additionally added layers to this. You're getting adjacent to some of the things I want to bring up, but it seems things are getting more active. Samir, I think your hand first, then we'll go back to Jeff, number one, then to Nilanthi.
Right. So maybe I might save some of this for the more frank conversation, but I like to be the naysayer in the room, so I'll offer a couple quick thoughts. I think I struggle to understand what the purpose of the Quad is, and I feel like I've heard several variants just in this conversation now. So there's the form, which is sort of this varying types of alignments, and I have a 2x2 that I sketched out a couple years ago that I'm happy to share that sort of identifies what I think are like the ways in which you can sort of align this. But then there's like the question, well, what is the purpose? And I think I've heard a few things just now about information and communication, which could sort of in the most robust form could be intelligence sharing, a focal point and coordination contact group, or just everyone sort of syncing up on the same page. but not sort of like the robust kind of intelligence sharing. Some sort of symbolic value and demonstration, fine. But I definitely heard Jeff and Tanvi both talk about deterrence. And so this is where sort of I kind of, I'm on board this quad train, and then I sort of start to raise some questions here. I'm not ready to get off, but I have some questions. So like my understanding of deterrence is that for it to be effective, it requires very clear signals of what either what the demands are or what lines could be crossed, a clarity of what is going to be done should those lines be crossed, and a demonstration not just of resolve to do those, but the capacity or capability to do all those things. And if this is going to be in a multilateral setting, it's the capacity to do these things together, because disaggregated, yeah, we can all do individual sales through South China Sea, but there's something about sort of demonstrating the capacity to do it together that is meaningful. And I just don't see these things happening. And maybe that's the aspiration, in which case sort of I'm back on the quad train. But it's not clear to me about how we're getting to that point where we're having some clarity about what it is that we are, besides the abstraction of the rules-based order, what is it that would violate that rules-based order? So identifying a clear threshold for what would violate it. How we're going to ensure a favorable balance of power. I mean, getting together in a room is not going to do that, but are we talking about aggregating forces in an actual contingency? So that would be sort of demonstrations of interoperability, or even a simple question which I posed recently to a colleague at DoD, which is like, are we even going to activate together? If something's going on in one part of the world, is there some expectation that the other part of the world is going to activate and start doing things to sort of ensure the defense of that, whether in that theater or their own theater? It's not even clear that's going to happen. So absent those things, I start to wonder what's the deterrent effect on China. And I would imagine that it's pretty limited. The evidence, what limited evidence there is out there about how alignments or alliances affect deterrence or conflict, the best work comes from Brett Ashley Leeds. And it's basically the findings, the empirical findings are that the only kinds of alignments that actually generate a deterrent effect on interstate disputes are ones of mutual defense agreements. Everything short of that, non-aggression pacts, sort of, playing footsie, other, coordination groups, those things don't deter. So it's all well and good if we think that the purpose of this is for coordination, intelligence sharing. I would actually think, though, if we're going to do intelligence sharing, it should be quieter. I would rather it be less sort of visible and more substantive. But if the purpose is deterrence, then it requires these attributes, and I just don't see those even happening yet. But if that's in tow and this is sort of like the long game, then I'm back on board again. I just don't know where it is.
Fair enough. Jeff, to you.
Yeah, always provocative, always contrarian. I love it when Samir is part of the group. It gives us good food for thought and things to debate. And actually, I think it's a very salient point. I don't think that the Quad in its current form is going to have a major impact on deterrence vis-a-vis China. I don't think that China would have been prevented from launching provocative moves at the India border if just the Quad had been stronger, had a stronger foundation. I think that's a fair point, that it will have limited value in terms of deterrence. But for me, that's fine. I pursue everything through a cost-benefit analytical lens. And what is the cost to us of doing the Quad? Very little, in my opinion. As Tanvi said, it's officials oftentimes already out at a multilateral summit that are just adding one more meeting to their agenda. And so if we all agree that the Quad has at least some limited benefits, somebody needs to explain to me what the costs are that outweigh those benefits that make this not productive. And, what is the purpose of the Quad, I think, is also a good question, because there have been different framing mechanisms, different definitions at times, different ways the Quad has been sold. But, what is the purpose of the India-Japan-US trilat? What is the purpose of the US-Australia-Japan trilat? It's to get the three countries together to talk about common opportunity, common threats, enhanced cooperation. That's fine. Everybody goes, yeah, that's great. That's a good idea. We're doing that. But when it comes to the Quad, that's not enough. It has to be something bigger and grander and more meaningful. What's wrong with just enhancing cooperation and coordination among for like-minded democracies at very little cost. I see no problem with that at all. But we should be cognizant of what the limits of that are and not oversell it. So I think that is a worthwhile, meaningful point that I think both Josh and Samir made. I do want to bring one other thing to the group, one other topic for discussion, and that is the freedom angle. The Quad talks a lot about a free and open Indo-Pacific for democracies working together. How do we thread the needle when it comes to cooperation with countries like Vietnam? Do we make this about democracy, or do we say it's really about a free and open order? So you can be an authoritarian government, but if on the international stage your actions are conducive to a free and open order, you're not restricting freedom of navigation, you're not engaging in certain trade practices, you're not engaging in territorial aggression, then you qualify. Or does the Quad really try to keep this a more sort of democratic-minded grouping? And this is something we came across in the Quad Plus dialogue. And in fact, specifically with Vietnam, like, do we want to bring in plus partners that are non-democracies? Singapore is also a case. So I think that's one of the more interesting questions related to the Quad and its future, and I'm certainly interested in any thoughts that others might have.
Let's see. According to my indicators, Tanvi, you were the next hand up, and then to Nilanthi.
So first, I'll just say Samir's come a long way on the Quad. I didn't even know he was on the Quad train. But but see, I actually think this is one of the things about that says something about the Quad or any platform, which is, I think sometimes kind of we make this a 0-1 binary, right? That either it's useless or it has to be doing everything an alliance is doing. And I'm not saying Samir's saying that, but I've heard others say it. And Samir, expressed his critique in a much more nuanced way, and I'll come to that. But I do think this is not going to be either the only platform, nor is it going to be a silver bullet that's going to solve all Asia's problems or make China behave like the responsible stakeholder we all wanted to single-handedly. Nor is it just an ornament that people throw out there and people like to talk about, or as I put it the other day, it's not just annual cocktail party. So I think it is kind of a step-by-step evolution, and I think Josh mentioned the U.S., India, Japan trilateral. It's worth remembering that started out at the working level in 2011, and it was step by step. It wasn't till 2015 that it both kind of became militarized, if you want to put it that way, if Japan was included in Malabar, and that it was upgraded to the ministerial. And I think it took another 2 or 3 years to do a leader level photo op. Now, I think what's important is it wasn't just these photo ops, right? The discussions became more sophisticated over time. And I think part of what the Quad does, I've always said this since the beginning, it will only continue to sustain if all 4 countries have value. And to me, even if all these 4 countries did was get in the room and share their assessments of China, I would think it had utility, because there's no other platform that they're having those conversations, even if they're doing none of the other stuff in practice. And actually, I've been surprised in these few years how much they're actually doing and talking and meeting on the sidelines, say, of a cyber summit, or the ambassadors in the region meeting regularly to have, or at least diplomats meeting regularly. So, I'm not of the view that we need to kind of have everything, why are we expecting it to be an adult when it's kind of 3 years old and behaving like an adult? And so I think we'll see where it goes. But I think if you say, well, it's not doing it right now, so it's not worthwhile, then I think it precludes what you could do in the future. And as all of you know, It's that building habits of cooperation and comfort level over time that, I've seen this in terms of how officials in India discuss this. It's not perfect, but it is a higher level of a discussion. Now, just kind of one more thing on the deterrence, and then on Jeff's freedom point. I wasn't talking about deterring together, but I think there is some work to be done to reestablish some sort of deterrence in Asia, in the Indo-Pacific, whatever you want to call it, and that there are deficiencies there. And these 4 countries are going to be key in establishing. So it doesn't have to be doing something together, but if these countries don't do some things, then you will definitely not reestablish that deterrence. It might not be through military means, it could be through others, but my point about deterrence was like together, at least you have to be on the same page of what behavior you think is unacceptable. And then on Jeff, your freedom point, look, I actually think most of the countries, I don't know what the administration's point of view on this is. I think there's already been more care about not making this about democracy versus not. The way I've heard it expressed is this is about countries having the freedom to choose whether, to make choices of their own, alluding obviously to China. But so I think this is not about whether or not, because frankly, if it will be exclusionary and it will leave out countries if you make it just about democracy. And I know the Cold War comparisons have a lot of deficiencies, but I can tell you one thing we will see is just like the Cold War, all the countries involved will engage with countries who don't have perfect democratic or governance records because of geopolitical reasons. That's just a fact of life. Finally, I think to me the biggest critique, and I will say this in the open setting because I can, to me the biggest critique of the Quad is that the Quad members need to live up to their own kind of things, their own principles that they're putting out there. So you can't engage in telling countries that you have to change your policies towards a third country. You can't engage in economic coercion. You can't engage, and you had to up your game on the democratic and liberalism side, or at least not falter. So, who amongst us these days is in a great position to go lecturing other countries in the world about these things? So that's my view on the freedom thing. I think we're better off sticking to the freedom to choose, make choices in terms of political, economic, and strategic choices in the broader sense, because I think it'll just be exclusionary otherwise. And I think the best way to convey the democratic governance and liberalism side is by showing it by being a model of them and through behavior.
Thanks, Jeff. Hope everyone can hear me. Actually, my comment it picks up well on Tanvi's point about the Quad being exclusionary. Jeff, I agree with you in your opening remarks about really the momentum of the Quad. It's hard to imagine a time when the Quad sort of have this staying power as it has over the past 3 years. China has certainly heightened a lot of countries' threat perceptions. So that certainly has helped to elevate the Quad and its relevance. But I think as the Quad continues to get built out, I think we need to think about how the Quad engages China, which may seem counterintuitive. But I think when we're thinking about, we talked about ways to operationalize the Quad, missions like humanitarian assistance and disaster relief, MDA, maritime domain awareness. The context, this region, the Indo-Pacific, it sees a lot of disasters, and we think about the origins of the Quad, which really was out of the tsunami, the 2004 tsunami cooperation, and the operational coordination that resulted from that. So I think we need to just consider a future where China, which certainly didn't have the naval capabilities it did in 2004, 2005, but definitely does now. And if another major disaster strikes the region, the Quad can definitely show their relevance, but the extent to which China can actually now actually has the capability to provide relief to countries. To what extent can the Quad, or to what extent will the Quad be willing to work with China on these matters of operational relevance, salience to the Indo-Pacific region? And then, and I think that's where you get into that risk area of what Tanvi was talking about so well about impressions or optics about the Quad being exclusionary, because if you actually do have a situation where China is actually contributing to public goods, like in the aftermath of a disaster, where it actually is following the standards of international law, where countries can sail where international law permits. I think that's a potential risk. We're talking about opportunities and risks. I think it's a potential risk to the Quad. So I think we should just start to think about maybe not in the next 1 or 2 years, because there does seem to be a momentum to the Quad, and it's continuing to get built out and operationalized. But maybe in the next 3 to 5 years, just to think about what that could look like of the Quad, how it engages China. I think one model that came to my mind is thinking about combined maritime forces in the Middle East and Bahrain. Due to the piracy menace and all the counter-piracy deployments to respond to it, you have these coalitions, so one of which is the US-led combined maritime forces, but you also have had China as an independent deployer, also India for that matter as an independent deployer, definitely not participating in CMF, but there's a way in which they engage, and there's a process there for them to engage. So I just throw that out there to get us thinking about ways in which the Quad and China may inevitably have to engage with her, even if by design, that wasn't part of the original thinking.
Thanks, Nilanthi. Jake, before I turn to you, I'm going to jump in if everybody doesn't mind. Use my power of the mobilizer here. Follow up with what Nilanthi said, for someone else who looks at these issues a lot through the maritime domain. The Quad, for me, has one great benefit for the U.S. side, just purely speaking from a U.S. point of view, and it is we don't get a lot of pomp and circumstance with the public relations in the Indo-Pacific. The Quad does. The Quad kind of gets this. It gets a lot of attention. It sucks in a lot of the conversation, and there is downside to that. But when we're having certain engagements, we're having conversations with countries, the Quad is one of the main mechanisms that is used to juxtapose all of the things that China does. Even though, a lot of, when you get into the specifics of a country by country look, a lot of things that China promises are not delivered, or if they are delivered, they're delivered in a different kind of way. Where the U.S. is and Japan and India and Australia and the European allies, what they promise tends to be what is delivered. And so the Quad it brings a little bit more assistance to the PR problem, honestly, that exists for the U.S. a little throughout the Indo-Pacific. The other issue is for the Quadrilateral is it's a way to navigate all of the kind of insane explosion of minilateral, localized, multilateral, trilateral engagements that have been flourishing throughout the Indo-Pacific. You've got various mechanisms in the Bay of Bengal. You have things going on inside of ASEAN states where all the actors can agree on, say, maritime domain awareness or other maritime actions. So there's a mini-lateral that emerges between, say, Malaysia, Indonesia, and Singapore to do something because they can't get the Philippines and Vietnam and Cambodia and Laos and others to sign on. And then also with some of the island states in the Indian Ocean itself, the issue right now over geography, as Nilanthi has written about extensively, but also Comoros and Seychelles and Mauritius, Madagascar, all of these other states here. There are ways for the Quad to be a communicative mechanism to link things that are being done to effectively assist those states with maintaining the rules of order, to pursuing their own development, without falling victim to any kind of nefarious, kind of action that a specific actor takes. French are very active. This is a way to get into the conversation about the Quad Plus when you're looking at the Western Indian Ocean. The Australians have all different kinds of ideas related to the environmental component of the maritime domain. That is one avenue that is being talked about when it comes to the Quad. But the issue for me is the quadrilateral, in my conception, in the long run, I think is an overarching mechanism in the Indo-Pacific to provide information sharing, not at the intelligence level, but just essentially among leadership, among senior leaders in these various countries, to kind of put a cap on the network, the quilt of various international engagements that are taking place among those who are advocating for the kind of rules-based order that the Quad members want to sustain. So those are kind of my, I think, initial thoughts on that. As to the overarching real purpose of the Quad, I don't really know what it is yet, other than if it can serve that function, I would be happy. Jake, you've been patient. Let me turn it back over to you, and then Jeff, I'll turn it back to you for some closing thoughts for this public session, and then we'll close it out. Jake.
Yeah, thanks. I can be relatively brief, but I wanted to speak for a second to Samir's question in the chat. He was asking about, for those who serve in government, whether the Quad meeting is on balance just more of a time suck, right? Opportunity cost, that maybe the juice isn't worth squeeze. I think it's actually opposite, in the sense that it provides a forcing function to drive forward a lot of these initiatives that may have not been thought of either in that context, and also to put it certainly at the ministerial level agenda in a way that wouldn't have been before. And yeah, I come at this a little bit more from the East Asia, from East into the Indo side rather than Indo into East. And so I think, especially in dealing with the Japanese and Australians, for many years the Indo side was not, just didn't get as much attention, and it is so important, and why it's gotten all this attention in the last few years, and really thankfully raised the profile of the folks who've been working on this for a long time. But I think in the sense of having a meeting like this that can raise up to the level of, to minister level and deputy secretary level is really important in that way. And if you're already out there, it is possible to add on too many meetings, very possible. But also if you're the secretary, you're already in Asia, not taking a chance to meet in that contact group style setup with the most like-minded of like-mindeds in any way would seem to me like a missed opportunity. So I do think the juice is worth the squeeze in that sense. Thanks.
Thank you, Jake, and very succinct. Josh, you'll be the last interjection before I turn it back over to Jeff number one.
Great. I'm glad I'm not the final word. I'm glad Jeff number one has that solemn duty. I mean, I just wanted to follow on Jake's comment and Samir's question. In the U.S.-India relationship context is probably a little bit different than in East Asia, where you have some very high capacity bureaucracies. The challenge that the United States has faced with India is that its bureaucracy in the Ministry of External Affairs and the Ministry of Defense and elsewhere is quite limited. And so on the one hand, it is very easy to propose more meetings, more exercises, more activities than the Indian government has the interest or capacity to handle. But it also means that in order to really keep things moving forward, you need a relatively consistent tempo of high-level meetings, right? So where does the Quad fit this in the Indian context, in the context of the U.S.-India relationship? Well, it's most likely going to continue to be a helpful meeting, but I do think some of this will depend on what the next administration decides to do about the architecture of the U.S.-India relationship. In particular, one could imagine a Biden administration that takes a step back in looking at the U.S.-India relationship sort of analytically, notes that the defense and security lane has moved forward quite well over the last 4 years. And as a former Obama person, I'm very happy to admit that and commend my counterparts in the Trump administration for continuing a real sort of drumbeat of interest, activities, and persistence on the defense and security issues. The overall U.S.-India relationship, however, has become, I think, somewhat unbalanced on trade issues, on people-to-people issues, on a range of diplomatic fronts. It simply doesn't look very strong. So I think there will be, in such a circumstance, if Biden wins, if there's a Biden administration, an interest in rebalancing the structure of the relationship to try to foreground some of those issues: energy, climate change, cyber issues, a whole range of things that really haven't, I think, gotten the proper attention. There will also be the question of what to do with the 2+2, which has been a very useful format in many ways, because it helped resolve some of the functional asymmetry that existed between the U.S. and Indian systems. On the U.S. side, the Pentagon had tended to dominate discussions of security matters over the State Department, and in India, the MEA had tended to dominate over the services or the MOD. So getting both sides, the civilians and the defense ministries together, was useful, but that's another item on the agenda at a high level. How would that fit into an attempt to sort of create a more comprehensive view? Would be an open question. So I would say I think there's definitely a place for the Quad and all of that, particularly because it can be done on the sidelines of existing meetings, because it addresses a range of issues that are not simply traditional security issues. I think it would be seen in a different light by an administration that is taking a step back to look at the full array of issues on the plate for cooperation, and thinking about where to allocate energy and where to sort of try to press for more out of the Indian bureaucracy. So that may be an issue that all of us will have to sort of grapple with analytically in the coming months. But I just wanted to put that out there.
I'll hold some of the follow-up comments I have to you, Josh, on that, because I think we can sympathize with each other with some of the struggles. But Jeff, number one, since this is kind of the end of the public iteration of this conversation, why don't you close us out with some of your final thoughts, and then we'll wrap up.
Yeah, not too much to add here, Jeff. I think it was a very productive exchange of ideas. I think that was the goal here, was to get some people together who think about these issues on a regular basis, and to put on the table some of the challenges, risks, opportunities that are facing the Quad. Some of these questions on how to frame the Quad, which path we should be pursuing, the language we use when we talk about the Quad. They're unsettled questions to a degree, and it's really helpful, frankly, to do some real-life think tanking. Getting some people in the room and bouncing ideas off each other is something I frankly wish we would do more of sometimes. And so I commend you for organizing this. I actually didn't realize the first part of this session would be public. So I'm glad others will get to a little window into how we deliberate on these matters. And frankly, I think we could have done with more time. And so if there's interest on your side in holding a follow-up discussion at some point soon, I'd certainly be interested as well. And just an extra thank you to everyone who took time out of their day today to join us for this. I thought it was very stimulating and productive.
Well said, Jeff. I'm not going to add anything other than just to thank everyone else for joining in. All those who watched this, thank you. And we'll do, and Jeff, NESA will definitely take you up on that follow-up conversation. So we're going to wrap it up things here now. Goodbye to everyone, and see you soon.